Hello, and welcome to Supply Chain Next. I'm your host, Richard Donaldson. Join me as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges practitioners face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network. Okay, well, welcome to the next episode of Supply Chain Next. I am excited to broaden our kind of format here in not only using video, but actually now having a three-person podcast. So I want to welcome Daniel Robin and Scott Donachie here to the episode. Hey, guys.
Hello. Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning. Absolutely. And super excited here because we're actually at the tail end of the year. We're going to be talking about circularity, sustainability, and all the effects in the supply chain. And you know, this is really stemming from Scott's work with zero waste. And then as an advisor to Zero Waste, Daniel is an investor also in the space, but I'll let both of them kind of give their backgrounds here. But let's start with just a quick intro, and maybe I'm going to start with you, Scott. Love to hear a little bit about yourself and actually about Zero Waste too, and how you kind of got into that.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much. It's an honor to work with you and be on this podcast with both of you gentlemen today. So I launched companies for Zero Waste 2 years ago. I have a background working on Wall Street, running hedge fund meetings for raising capital, and worked in banking for 10 years. Got pretty burnout on it. I've always had a real big passion for the environment. One of my really good friends that lives here in New Jersey has a company which is called Java's Compost. And he launched that company a few years ago, and they go door to door collecting compost for residences, and they're moving into businesses. But I saw the struggles that he had with his business in New Jersey with a lot of the regulations and rules and really prohibiting him from expanding his business. And I did a lot of research and found out that just in New Jersey, there's over 400 dormant landfills, and there's a huge issue with waste. So doing that due diligence, really just saw the opportunity with my background in running these meetings on Wall Street. Why can't we do something similar that would drive and really accelerate the whole movement towards zero waste and connect the right people, just get the right people that can come in, the investors, the policymakers, the regulators, supply chain directors, so that we really can start understanding that waste needs to be redefined as resource optimization, and we need to change our lens. And just been really a great journey for the last 2 years, and I'm super excited about next year and the things that are on the horizon. So thank you. That's a quick background.
Yeah, and Scott, that's a great background. And let me double click on that for a second, because your timing probably couldn't have been much better. I mean, it's not like recycling and circularity and sustainability haven't been conversational. Almost like global warming or global cooling or climate change or whatever has been a topic of conversation, but hasn't really, the teeth haven't kind of gotten sunk in until recently. And arguably in the last few years, I think you've seen a different inertia, momentum, building around this. So talk about your timing and what you've kind of learned over the last few years in starting Zero Waste, and your experience there, because I don't know if you started Zero Waste 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you would have had the same reception.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I started 2 years ago and started with just the phrase companies for zero waste, or even saying zero waste, we were branded as, maybe a special interest group, or we were put into that bucket with the zero waste certification people that are out there with 90%, landfill diversion. And what's happened is that the market, has changed in the last 2 years. And I really feel that zero waste is going mainstream. So you can see, companies like McDonald's now have a zero waste program, and they're getting excited, and they're working with, companies that are out there like TerraCycle, or, they're starting to look at packaging differently. So I just like the fact that 2 years ago, when I mentioned zero waste, and just to be straight up about it, corporations were running in the other direction, thinking that they may be vilified. Now they're embracing it and saying, all right, what can we learn from our peers and our supply chains? Maybe we don't want to keep it so it's just us looking at our supply chain. Maybe we can learn and collaborate with other supply chain directors, CEOs, and people in operations and material engineers to find out how do we start doing business differently? So I'm excited about it because people are now, they're answering their emails, they're taking the calls, and they want to find out how they can get involved. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's a great segue. I don't know if you planned it that way, to kind of go over to Daniel here and talk about how Daniel got involved with zero waste, and also your work, Daniel, as an investor with In3 Group. Love to hear about that, but from what I've looked at, it looks like it kind of dovetails exactly what Scott's talking about. You've got an organization that here is funding projects that may have these underlying environmental, sustainability, circularity goals. Love to hear about you and your background and how you got introduced and involved with Scott and zero waste.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. We've been involved in the sustainability aspects for mostly business folks since the 1990s. Goes all the way back into the late 1990s. At that time, there were some pretty significant gaps in the continuum of funding for new ventures, in particular new kinds of clean technologies. Actually, it wasn't called clean tech back in that day. We coined the phrase sustainable tech because it really wasn't a thing yet, right? And the fact was then, and still today, that extracting inefficiency and waste is often really profitable. It can make more money than just incremental changes, improvements, lots of innovations on the market. But when you can take a resource that's currently a liability, and what is waste? It's displaced resources. It's resources that got in the wrong place. But you can capture those and return those to some sort of part of the value chain, the supply chain, create a value out of a liability. And so that's really what got my company going back in the 90s. And we were addressing gaps and called myself a venture catalyst back in those days, trying to, help the younger companies that had good clean tech ideas that weren't really necessarily commercial ready to get commercial, to commercialize those. And then it evolved to the point now where we've got solutions everywhere for the problems facing us, more innovations on the way, a lot of innovation now in business models rather than the fundamental tech, but still technology innovations are going to have their place. And so we've scaled that up to the point where we're seeing mid-market project finance that makes a lot of sense, and the capital is available for this to scale and solve the critical problems of this world. It's kind of shocking to say it. You said, well, if we've got the money, what do we need? Well, one thing we need is an understanding and collaboration and political will and business people mobilized to solve these problems.
Yeah, well, and let me kind of follow on with the same question I asked with Scott, because you've, again, got a 30-year history where you've been looking at this. And something's changed in the last few years. It's not like the mission statement that you started with in 1990 has changed all that much, right? But the reception you're getting, not only in, sourcing funds for projects that are moving in sustainability, circularity methods, but how people are looking at this, right? Like something changed mentally, philosophically, right? Because what you just said, which is a leading point that I think we're going to get to, is that sustainability and circularity is not a nice to have. It's actually a profit and margin improvement opportunity. And I don't know why it's taken so long for people to figure that out, but you're in a really cool spot, Daniel, to even kind of reflect on that. Like what's happened, right, in the last few years? Like what changed?
It's an interesting parallel in the electric vehicle market, for example.
Yeah, great.
Right. Right. Whereas EVs have been around for a long time, and golf carts and whatnot. Right. Well, what's causing them to start finally to take off and gain more mainstream acceptance? A lot of things just take a long time to commercialize. I think the big limitation on EVs remains the storage. That's also going to be changing and breaking through to something new. But of course, Tesla's been leading. A lot of other players and a lot of other products. But if you look at the market penetration right now for electric vehicles, battery electrics in particular, it's not there. And it needs to get there. And it's going to gradually, reach the scale that's necessary to actually make a difference and decarbonize the whole transportation scene. Electric and hybrids are happening more in buses. And you'll see more air travel, that's right, and trucks, long-distance haul trucks, these things. And it depends on the sector and the economic drivers and inhibitors, I suppose. And what we're definitely looking forward to is the upswing. And recently, I can say, I don't know the exact causes. I'm not sure it's even been studied why so much more consumer sentiment now for sustainability, circularity, cleaning things up. It has something to do with health, something to do with the fact that we are living in an ecosystem, right? And so the ecosystem and we are in this symbiotic embrace, right? So if the environment is not clean, neither can we be. Right. And so I don't know. I mean, I've seen Hurricane Katrina was an interesting moment, right? That catalyzed a lot of folks' interest in and involvement and practice in sustainability, right? More concern about our long-term viability as a species. You know, the planet will be fine. It'll recover. In fact, you may have observed yourselves, I've been seeing examples of this, and people talk about this a lot during the COVID pandemic, right? With less commuters, right? So systems are less strained, less air pollution, cause and effect, right? So you got to wonder, you know, who is having this effect? We are, okay? So the numbers, the carrying capacity of the planet, and so on. But I've noticed it. There's been an incredible increase in interest in doing the right thing, being responsible, mixed with the business side, creating good jobs, finding profitable models, you know, converting products into services. That's another good business model innovation. You don't really need a car. You need the services of a car, mobility and transportation, right? But that's a classic in some ways. It's called leasing, but there are other innovations on top of that. So this is true in my world. I'm sure in yours and Scott's too. We all are much more interested in health and sustainability and wellness and taking care of ourselves, and taking care of the planet goes right along with that.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I think that's I'm going to swing back to Scott here in a second, but kind of again, I think the underlying theme here is that without a doubt, and coming from an investor point of view, Daniel, coming from a kind of, I'll call it nonprofit think tank consultancy, Scott, with zero waste, right? Where you're kind of influencing, then I'm kind of coming at it from a practitioner point of view, and building a platform. But there's no question that sustainability and circularity are not only top of mind, they're actually getting put into project plans within companies now. That's very different from before, right? So regardless of how we got here, that's where we are today. So Scott, in looking at what you're catalyzing in conversations within zero waste, what's happening now coming, out of COVID? Like, what are your observations amongst your cohort of participants, and what are they talking about in reaction to COVID? How has that emphasized the need to look at the supply chain, and more specifically, their asset disposition lifecycle management in the context of zero waste and circularity, right? How, what's happening now coming at the close of 2020 within your community? What are you hearing? What's going on?
Well, I'm feeling, when we had a meeting a year ago, we had a big meeting in Newark, New Jersey, and we had about 350 sustainability experts that came together, supply chain directors, CEOs. I had a feeling that people were still just focused on what's in their wheelhouse. And when I say that, if you got a supply chain director or someone who was working in, let's say, renewable energy, they wouldn't want to necessarily find out about, let's say, the textile industry. That's not in our wheelhouse. We have no interest. What I'm finding now, which is really pretty wonderful, is that people are starting to work outside of their supply chain and finding out from other companies, well, what are the issues that you're running into today? It seems like, for instance, like the fashion industry, everyone knows each other. Or if I go into let's say e-waste, they all know each other. It's a very small market, much smaller than I thought, because I look at like e-waste, this massive problem, and then I see there's 3 or 4 real thought leaders in the United States leading the space. And it's like, wow, that's incredible. But what's happening now with this whole evolution of zero waste is that now companies are recognizing that there are issues that they can learn from other experts that are in supply chain, that are in sustainability, that are investing. They're running into the same type of issues with water, with energy consumption, with looking at things holistically. So I think it's a really good opportunity because people over the last 10 months have been able to take a step back and look at other industries and see, hey, let's not just vilify this industry, just throw out the oil and gas industry. Let's find out what are the gaps that they have today, and how can we work together to accelerate everything towards a more circular, economy or supply chain. And also the fact that, people don't have to look at the lens, and it's getting better, of, okay, we need to switch our whole linear supply chain over to circular. It's going to cost too much money. Let's just punt and not do it. Now it's, okay, let's try this. Let's try this and see if it works. Let's try this and then see if we can scale it up. Let's look at zero waste design. I think people in the United States are starting to take that type of view, and Europe is helping to accelerate that. That's what I'm finding from my lens.
Are you, and again, let me double click on that, because you've got an interesting view where you're looking at not only the commonality across different verticals, right, which is super important, but then within that commonality, are there certain, I'll call them kind of drivers that you're seeing, right? I mean, it's a bit of a leading question, because I think the answer in all of our collective heads is that there's a recognition that it's a good business practice to focus on circularity and sustainability, not just a nice to have, feel good kind of thing, right? That's a big difference right now. It's still not very widely, I think, accepted. But how do you capitalize then on the enthusiasm, which is to feel good, and help people to understand that, okay, feeling good is great and all, but actually this is going to help your business be more profitable. Can you kind of talk to that observation and how that's entering the conversation now?
Yeah, I think, like, from my lens and from working with different experts, and I'll give you an example. I worked with wonderful woman, Stephanie Benedetto from Queen of Raw, and she captures a lot of textile materials that she uses, and they repurpose to make clothes, that would normally be sitting in a warehouse for 2 or 3 years. So I was completely shocked from working in, hedge funds and software and all this technology and innovation. Why is it that the innovation isn't there? Like with, tier, go to whatever, tier 14 or 15 vendors, and they're doing things on spreadsheets or using paperwork. Like, I was just really surprised by that. But what I'm finding now is that by companies or people sharing stories of saying, hey, you know what? We have materials that are deteriorating. We have assets that are deteriorating. The electronic e-waste industry is fascinating to me. You have billions of dollars of precious metals going to landfill, every year. And then you see these videos of, like, young children burning motherboards, getting paid like $1 a day. And you just sit there and go, I don't understand why there's billions of dollars in precious metals in landfill, and this is happening today. There's a problem here, and it's an opportunity to make a lot more money, do good for the environment, and then also solve a social problem. So like those three things are really going to move forward in 2021, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great observation. And again, I think you're getting this format here because you're teeing up Daniel very well, because that's a nice shift into how has that changed the capitalization of some of these projects from your point of view, because you're not only looking, Daniel, at funding, and then there's sort of an inherent question here is, are you helping to fund projects that enterprises take on in the migration towards circularity and sustainability? And then are you also funding innovations in the sector like you might do in a traditional venture kind of role, right?
Yeah, definitely both. The main thing we do is what's called mid-market impact project finance, impact finance, impact investing. You may have heard the phrase. A lot of folks are new to it. It's amazing to me how long that term has been around, and still folks go, what? Impact? What do you mean? It means the triple bottom line, social, environmental, and alongside profit. This is not, they're right. It kind of came from the more philanthropic NGO or, not-for-profit, purpose-driven kind of investments. But these days, and for easily a decade, go to the GIN, Global Impact Investment Network, has a great annual report that explains what's going on in that space, but it means that it's quite profitable to be centered on environmental and social benefit. Okay, that's really, it's one or the other, or maybe in some cases all three, the triple bottom line. This is kind of a parallel to the ESG side of the equation. corporations that are looking after the environment, social, and governance aspects. And so, yes, mid-market projects with existing tech that's really quite scalable and profitable have been taking off. I suppose we've been at a tipping point for quite a while, and we've tipped.
Yep.
It's my experience of it, right? The demand, the interest, and the number of projects and developers has gone way through the roof in a good way, kind of to a next level of activity and people kind of coming online with teams and project proposals that make a lot of sense. There's still, and there always will be, room for fundamental innovation, working out issues and inefficiencies, working, capturing waste. For example, anytime there's a change in a resource that can be more efficient, a resource that's being converted inefficiently, right? Often there are catalysts used in chemistry, or say the pressure in water pipes that get stepped down. If you don't make use of these conversions, of these catalytic moments, if you don't truly make most efficient use of the materials, then somebody's going to come along and figure out a way to do that.
Right.
And they'll be more profitable, and they'll be the new leader. That's the way it works, right? These are the kinds of fundamental innovations. And you see that across every sector, every resource you could imagine, including Scott's example, materials that would have just been lost. Right. Right. A good one would be, say, rubber from tires. Oh my goodness. The manufacturers of tires are now sourcing recovered carbon black. Why? Because the old way of making it, petroleum, otherwise known as furnace carbon black, is dirty and getting more and more expensive. So phase out, phase in. Yep. Recovered carbon black now it meets all the same specs, right? And is actually just as, it performs just as well, in some cases a little bit better, and it can come from the tires that were used and then disposed of. Right. So that's the zero circularity, circular economy in action. That's one example. It's across the board, and lots of you also get the metal out of the tires, right? And so this is also happening in agriculture, food production, sustainable foods, on and on. Examples, lots of them. But mostly in the capital markets, public equities right now are still pretty frothy. Right. Right, and overvalued, in some areas, with negative interest rates for, banks just sitting on money, private wealth sitting there. What do I do with it? And so the mid-market project finance side has really been going and growing steadily with consistent results, proving how much money is to be made in doing the right thing. And that's across the board, from renewable energy, certainly agriculture, food systems, water, materials, even, in fact, so you might find this surprising, a lot of folks do, believe it or not, there's still construction going on. Maybe luxury tourism's going to have to wait a while, okay? We're not going to, but people are planning ahead to the day, when the vaccines have kicked in and we've got good immunity. And so there's a lot of folks who are, those are 2 and 3 year build outs. So we don't see a slowdown on that aspect of the economy. I think the big controversial part to talk about, if I'm not sure going to go into this, but consumer packaged goods, that's interesting. Yep.
So let me double click, or triple click, I guess I should say, with Daniel is, so inherent in how you approach an enterprise, when you talk to them about, a project, and you've been doing it for 30 years, have your economic models or leading reasons to drive the project forward, have ROIs changed, have, break-even points changed, because now it's, through a lot of data, and I'm sure you've got 30 years of it, this isn't just a nice to have program. This is how to make your company more money. And given the enthusiasm and the demand now that you see for aftermarket enterprise assets in total across all industries, I would suspect that in your modeling, when you're approaching these users, is to show like, hey, you guys can make your money back within probably months, right? If you start this, it's not, you're not going to bleed cash in this type of program.
Right. and I think these are some of the better opportunities in the current market.
Right.
You know, not frothy, consistent results, right? Predictable results.
Right.
There are more modest returns in certain sectors. For instance, solar now has become, thankfully, quite popular, and at least in the U.S. and developed countries, often, if you're looking to set up a, say, utility scale solar farm, you might get more modest returns, IRRs below, say, 10%. Because the price of electricity that's for the offtake of that electricity is lower because it's competitive, right? So so it should be. But in other markets, still, where the price of electricity, there's no better option. They don't have cheap grid power. Right. And the cleaner the power, there's an assumption that it needs to cost more. Not necessarily. Right. You know, it depends. We have quite an entrenched infrastructure here in the U.S., right? And we're in California. For a while, there was an oversupply, right? You've heard these stories where they had to pay to get rid of electricity. Well, those are the exceptions. For the most part, solar, wind, small hydro, even now we're starting to see examples of where waves can be captured, tidal power. All of these things are quite profitable. Typical IRRs, I don't know if this means anything to non-financial folks, but the internal rate of return, the profit measure that matters most, can be certainly above 10% into the mid-teens. 12, 13, 14. That's good money. By any measure, right? That's pretty significantly profitable. And mostly it's quite profitable to extract and use waste. For corporates that want to add, for example, utility scale, greener, cleaner energy, it makes a lot of sense these days. It's cheaper than coal. It's cheaper than, right? And so, in fact, the whole idea of renewable energy as a commodity, if you can deal with the end-of-life solution of solar panels, we've been talking about that at the zero waste side. What do you do with solar panels after 25, 30 years, or wind turbines, et cetera? You're going to have you recycle them just like you would any e-waste is what you do. But the profit's definitely there. It's quite compelling. There's a lot of new jobs, good jobs being created around that industry, and a half a dozen others I could rattle off. It's quite a compelling time.
Yeah, and so those are incredible examples of where I think a lot of people's heads go, which is on power generation, right? Since that's there's a conflation with circularity and sustainability with the easy one, which is, how do I generate power, right? So we talk about oil and gas and renewables and all that sort of stuff. And so Scott, but it's broader than that, right? We're actually looking at what you're looking at is with zero waste, you're actually talking about every single company, right? And not only how they maybe generate the power to run their business, but what do they do with the assets that run their business? How do they manage those? How do they recycle those? How do they set that up? How does one company look at their balance sheet and say, I've got a couple $1 trillion worth of assets. I should be shedding 10% of that on an annual basis and actually making money on the disposition program there. And then there's another company that should be looking at that shedding of assets and say, I can use that stuff, right? Used or sometimes pre-owned and never used. I mean, this is what we're finding now is, and I see this every single day in our universe, is all of these major energy companies that have had projects that have stopped in the last year. And therefore they're sitting on, I'm talking billions, probably close to $1 trillion or $2 trillion of brand new unused assets that will never be used again by them, that's sitting there as an opportunity for someone who needs a bunch of steel or pipe or controls, right? So how are you seeing that shift into what we're really talking about? Because consumers take for granted, we recycle our garbage, we expect the plastics and the packaged goods, and we like to see renewable cardboard. Now enterprises are catching up to that, and that requires that enterprises think about selling stuff in a way that they haven't done diligently before, and other companies revisiting how they source things, because an enterprise almost, and I can say this, always wants to buy brand new from the OEM, and it's almost like it feels like a risk to them to buy something that's pre-owned, right? They don't have the same certification, but that's just not true, right? So how is that in the middle of the conversations that you're facilitating for zero waste today and kind of looking forward a little bit? To me, that feels like the crux of one of the big things that's going to shift here is how these assets move through the continuum of the supply chain from company to company.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. Just a quick example of this with companies working together, and this is what gets me excited about zero waste. We have a company that's speaking at a meeting in January, the supply chain meeting, but they've upcycled over 1 million pounds of medical waste into infrastructure material that's going to last 80 to 100 years. And
Wow.
So, these are the type of collaborations between two big OEMs that it's really exciting to see this, because they've come together and said, okay, we can upcycle this medical packaging material. We're going to be able to do this. Let's try it. And they did it last year, and now they're going to scale it to a different level. And the plastic that's being used is less expensive than virgin plastic, which is amazing. And it's post-industrial waste.
Right.
So you're doing good for the environment. You're driving more efficiency in your supply chain, and you're creating something that's going to last 80 to 100 years.
Right.
So that's just awesome. And we see more and more of these partnerships taking place between these companies and also the government, to find out how do we collaborate together to capture some of these feedstock and these waste and these materials and repurpose them.
And so that, it kind of getting into that a little bit further, but, anecdotally, and I think this is another kind of factoid that's out there that a lot of people don't even realize, but, and you probably see this, but in recycled, let's talk about metals for a second, right? So if someone goes out and gets all that copper and steel and smelts it or whatever and recycles it, the output of that quote unquote recycled metal meets the same standards as brand new metal, right? I heard that from someone who's a recycler, and I was like, well, wait a minute here. So you're telling me that there's no difference from a standards point of view in the copper that I buy that's quote recycled versus the copper I buy from some new OEM that farmed it out of the ground? And he's like, there's zero difference. There's metallurgic standards that we have to meet. And I said, well, what's the problem? Why aren't people should be buying from you left and right. It's cheaper and it's the same standard. He's like, because I can't get enough supply, which is fascinating. And therefore, because I'm inconsistent in my output, companies need this stuff so consistently, they can't count on my output and therefore don't buy from me because I don't have enough stuff. It's like, my head nearly exploded. I'm like, wait a minute. You're telling me everyone wants to buy this. It's cheaper and the same quality, but the only reason you can't do it is because you can't get access to it. Like, what's missing here?
Well, and let me jump in on this one, because there are examples across the board, many different industries now that and I gave one, and I'll beat this drum a little. It's the recovered carbon black side, right? Because there are now technical pathways where RCB, recovered carbon black, can be made consistently, exactly the same batch to batch. The good news is there are ASTM standards for almost all these materials, but metals, carbon, you name it, right? And the ASTM standards are what run the show. Right. So batch-to-batch consistency, or even continuous processes that now produce what's needed by industry, has changed in the last couple of years. It's not across every industry, but in many sectors, tires are a great example. They can now access these materials at the same or better prices that are coming from recovered materials, or they've made essentially what was one-way trip fossil-derived materials. They've made them renewable. Same in the whole waste to energy sector. And to your point, and I agree with you. First off, from a corporate point of view, it really depends on waste intensity, right? What is it? What are the main things being used by that company? Those are the drivers. Okay, if they're using a lot of energy, then their energy footprint is most important. If they're using other materials, et cetera, to run the company, then that's where they need to focus. Okay, just from a basic strategy point of view, right? So the more I reference solar and wind only because they're more common.
Absolutely.
I think they do. I'm not sure that everyone even still understands, but enough folks seem to get it and want solar panels on their roof or whatever it is that's gone on, right? But the new darling of the energy world is renewable energy from waste. Plastics, for example, as Scott was giving the example of medical waste, is mostly plastics. There's so many calories locked up in that stuff, right? And by a process. There's a lot of different ones that make sense, but my preferred one, a lot of my partners think this too, is got a thermochemical decomposition. You could even say thermochemical depolymerization, pyrolysis, gasification, these kinds of pathways, quite clean. Pyrolysis has no air emissions per se, right? And even though California got off on the wrong foot about that. But those are examples of where you can take a plastic or mixed municipal solid waste or whatever's got calories in it, get the calories out. It reduces the mass of the thing significantly. You end up with a char that takes up hardly any space. If you start off with a biomass, this is a celebrated pathway to biochar. They talk about it sometimes, right? Biomass, dry biomass, which is something we have way too much of here in California. Hint, hint.
Yep.
Yeah, you end up with, right, quite a profitable path, and the energy that's produced from that, it makes a lot of sense if you can secure the feedstock for it. If you've got the raw material in, right, then you solve this scale problem on the output, both for a consistent supply of energy, and often there's three fractions. There's a solid, there's a liquid, and there's a gas component, right? The gas is really the energy. The solid is often a product unto itself. That's the case with recovered carbon black. Carbon black is actually more valuable than the energy that comes from that path. Anyway, so these are the pathways that now are well proven. Some of these solutions have been on the market for more than a decade. Commercial operation at scale. It's no longer a question. It was quite a question. In fact, being involved in the waste to energy space for, well, I don't know how long I've been doing it, maybe 15, 16 years, it's kind of seen as a wild new frontier for a long time. You know, people don't really know the value of the products coming off, and they're not sure how to exactly make, the technology maybe will last, maybe won't. Well, not anymore. That's now established, and there's no doubt about it. These pathways make sense, and the big, Michelin North America is committed to using recovered carbon black. They're going to phase out the furnace stuff, and a lot of others are doing the same thing. So, examples.
Yeah, no, it's a fabulous example, and that's exactly what we're talking about, right? And again, to all of us on here, we've been thinking about this for a while, and probably Daniel, maybe you longer than all of us, going back to 1990. But it's just the timing of it, right? It's just all of a sudden, it's like enterprises just woke up in the last 18 months, and we're like, oh my God, like how have we been missing this? Because they've been running at full speed, trying to drive their businesses and increase sales and profits and focusing on their procurement. And there's more to the business, right? There's all these assets flowing through the business, not just for products, but that run the business. That is a key, you track it on your balance sheet. I mean, let's be honest here. The global 2000s are sitting on $187 trillion worth of assets, right? That is nearly 2.5 times the size of the entire world's GDP, right? That's the accumulated asset. And that's the book value, right? That's not the market value. Right. So if you think about that, what that really means in my estimation is that 187 trillion is probably worth close to 300 trillion in the market. Right. Because that's just all valuable stuff. Right. So that delta between what's on book and what it could be sold for is the free cash that's sitting there for enterprises if they embrace this program. So it's like, hey, everybody, let's wake up here and realize you got $150 trillion war chest sitting out here of free cash that all of you can dip into if you just manage the disposition of your assets properly, right? That usually wakes people up. But let me flip back to Scott a little bit. And now we're kind of looking forward. How do you look forward now into 2021 coming out of this year? I mean, we're closing out 2020, and then it's been, for all of us, pretty crazy. But in the context of circularity and sustainability, it's like, I mean, sometimes I'm giddy just being in supply chain because everything's supply chain. But even in a subset of that, or even broader, how do you want to look at it, circularity and sustainability is a really cool spot to be right now. It's sexy. How does it change your view, or what do you see kind of looking forward now as we move into the new year?
Yeah, I think we have all these buzzwords out there: circularity and green, sustainable, zero waste. Climate change is, and everyone's tackling these. But I feel the days of just looking at like a corporate sustainability report and looking, in the rearview mirror are over. I think now, actually, I'm confident now that companies are coming out and they're looking at ways to, cut costs, look at their assets, look at their overall balance sheets, take a proactive approach to waste, and really redefine it. What excites me about this too is 6 months ago, my son, his name's Finley, he's a material engineer at RPI, but he wrote a cover letter about changing mass consumerism. And I nearly spit out my coffee because I don't talk to him about what I do for a living.
Right.
But his friends that are all, 18 years old, they get it. They get zero waste and they have a different lens than us. So like anything else, I mean, when you see the youth embracing it, you get really excited because these kids are, they're younger, they're very technologically advanced. They think differently than us. And I've always noticed with trends, like when the younger generation's in there, it's definitely going to change and it's going to change quickly. So that's kind of like the view that I'm seeing is that companies are starting to come out and share their stories and saying, hey, you know what? We had this issue. We're a big auto manufacturer. We're not perfect. Don't vilify us, but this is what we're doing to move towards zero waste. How can other people help us as well? Even competitors. What can we learn from some of the mistakes that have gone on over the last 10 years? That's where I see things moving forward for next year, where there's more transparency, there's more trust. And I'm realizing too that some of these issues, especially when I speak to Daniel and you talk about regulators and you talk about policy and you talk about geography and you talk about getting all the right stakeholders to the table, it can seem really daunting. But at times it's not. It's just getting those people together to understand things that are outside of their wheelhouse so they don't need to, like look up these words and understand them. Like putting a banker in the room with a sustainability director or someone who has a PhD in like chemistry, it can be really hard because they don't understand what the other person is talking about.
Right.
But I'm noticing over the last 6 months, or especially during the COVID, that people now are starting to go outside of their wheelhouse and saying, oh, what can I learn? What can I learn from the banking sector? Where are they investing? Why is this important? Why can I learn from a sustainability director, even though I work on Wall Street? Like people are starting to open up their minds that way. So that's what's really exciting about next year.
No, that's cool. And that's a great, also, again, kind of, bat the ball back to Daniel here, looking at not only advising zero waste and what Scott's doing, and kind of, how would you, build off of what he's saying coming up to next year, but then also kind of, bring it into your own firm and what you guys are doing, right? I mean, there's kind of two aspects of that. One is you represent certainly 30 years of experience in here, seeing something new, and you're advising Scott as a networking group, consultancy, kind of matching all this stuff, right? So how do you want a group like this to be effective? And then how does that affect your own personal business and what you guys are funding and going after, right? I mean, all sorts of stuff happening.
Well, my big bold prediction for 2021 is that we're going to survive all this somehow. That's
provided it's not an asteroid or aliens or something, but who knows at this point, right?
Exactly. Yeah, to key off of what you were saying, Scott, I agree. Actually, the measurement and transparency and trust aspects of this, trust is an interesting word. It's a feeling, right? But what it really boils down to, I think, a better definition of trust is predictability, being able to predict what the other party's going to do, even if you don't like it exactly, being able to predict it, understand it, make sense out of it, and work with it. Because the more important task here, is what you also said, is the collaboration that must unfold. It has already unfolded. It's working with others that you share differences. Share differences. These aren't words that you hear much, but I'm going to say it's co-opetition with frenemies. You hear frenemies, right? What's co-opetition? It's collaboration and competition at the same time. You got to watch the boundaries and the edges and not disclose stuff you're going to regret later. Okay, but it is nonetheless what are the defining differences? That's where the power in a relationship comes from. If we all bring the same thing to the table, then some of us aren't needed. Maybe I'm the one not needed, right? But so taking a leadership role to co-opetate, no such word, with frenemies, right, with companies that you might not normally work with, get out of the silos, get out of the, right, and go across disciplines and learn from everybody and everything.
Right.
Right? Learn from everybody and everything that could possibly happen. I mean, we provide access to capital And a lot of the things that we do we have an innovative model. I've never bumped into anybody else that's doing similar kind of access to funds. We make funds available that break some of the rules, the common sense rules of banking. We're using banks, but we're not approaching it at all in a conventional way. Okay,
Right.
I'll leave that. Most folks that know banking and finance are very confused at first when they talk to us, right?
Right.
So
right.
the teaching and learning piece of this, the ability to actually listen to one another, being able to understand what somebody else is saying, that's still the gold in the current economy. You know, a little trickier through Zoom, perhaps. Right. But it needs to happen, and it does, and it is happening. So the drivers of waste to value are really less the bottom line, more the need to survive. I mean, there's economic upside in doing the right things. There's economic upside to being more efficient. Waste always pays. There's a dividend from being more efficient. That's a given. But designing products to use recovered material. Can you incorporate recover? It's kind of like, I remember a couple decades ago, what was it? Recycled paper, right? Most folks didn't want to put recycled paper in their, inkjet or laser printer. They didn't trust it. Right. And it's still a little more expensive. Well, the green stuff can be at a premium, or it actually could be less expensive depending on the supply, right? So there's just room to do the right thing and to be a little bit of a leader in this space, whatever that means to the parties involved. Have goals and lead toward them. Yep. Right? Rocky Mountain Institute said we got about a decade to decrease carbon by about 50%. Right. So decarbonize everything. Right. Well, I think right. Go ahead. To your point on that, though, is I think those are oftentimes the leading drivers where, I look at someone like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, right, who's probably, let's just say it, the world's largest NGO in this space, right? And they're flooded and they try to publish stuff and they work with all sorts of people and they've got these kind of leading, like, why do you want to get into this stuff? And usually it's driving them towards, hey, we got to reduce our carbon. Hey, we got to reduce our footprint. Again, really good, nice to have. What do you guys think about shifting it to, like, that's great and all, but this is about profitability. This is about your company being healthier and returning more value to shareholders. Because I guarantee if you're Shell and you're sitting on 200 and you buy 250 billion, this is literally what they do. They buy $250 billion worth of assets per year. Okay. Just let that percolate for a minute. So over 10 years time, they've purchased $2.5 trillion worth of stuff. Okay. So how much of it there is currently sitting on that's on their balance sheet? Like I said, and let's just say $1 trillion. What if they liquidated all of that? They probably could get $1.5 trillion back. That's $500 billion of free cash back to the business. Forget everything else. This is where I'm kind of like, and Scott, you and I have talked about this. This is where I beat the desk a little bit. I'm like, environmentalism and circularity is awesome, but let's be honest. I'm going to speak to your capitalist heart. I'm going to speak to your profitability, right? It just so happens that if you embrace this circularity concept and your business becomes more profitable and healthier margins, you're inevitably falling into environmental patterns that are great for everybody. But we don't need to beat you up about doing what's right about the planet. I'm going to go even more selfishly. I'm going to make you more money, right, by embracing circularity. So Scott, let me start with you. How is that changing even in our conversations? How do you feel that might change people's even pace at which they're adopting these things?
So that's a really good point. I feel like, from our lens, when we're talking to somebody, we need to be like a chameleon sometimes. So if I'm speaking to someone who, is a director for a sustainability program and they're running reports, that's different than talking to, a CFO. That's different than talking to a supply chain director. So I know that we need to change our language. I think a really wonderful article I read about a year ago was called Word Pollution. And we have a lot of that in this industry, which is really interesting. Because if you go to someone in finance and start talking about circularity and saving the planet, they're going to hang up on you. Let's be
right.
They don't care. They don't care because it's not they don't care, but it's what's in front of you. What's the shiny object? What's preserving your job? What's driving your company? So when you go in and you speak to someone from, a decision maker that's a bean counter, let's talk about assets. Let's talk about profitability, because there's so much that we can sink our teeth into with inventory and with, depreciating assets and all these different things that happen at a corporation where they're not efficient. I've worked in Fortune 500 companies. The fact is, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing many times. But that's okay, because many companies just don't know where to start and they're intimidated, so they walk away.
Right.
And I understand, because there's a big misperception that it's a cost center and they're going to be vilified. But at the same point, if we jump in and roll up our sleeves and we have a roundtable discussion with other experts and we can touch on these points, their lens is going to change, just like it does with my son or someone who's 18. It's very hard to teach someone who's like a 55-year-old CEO about changing their linear supply chain, of course.
Right.
But when you start talking the same language with them, all of a sudden they open up and they start listening. So I think there's a really big opportunity for this, especially for the C-level suite next year.
Yep. Daniel?
Well, it is about profitability. It always was, and it always will be, unless you're a nonprofit. In which case, it's still about profitability. You just don't get to keep the profits. Right? No, I agree with you. I think the real question, the real issue, the touchstone, the challenge in all of this is the time horizon for profit. Is it going to continue to be about the quarterly earnings and nothing else? You're going to milk that, the cash cow until it falls over, okay? Or you're going to lead a little.
Right.
Draining the last bit of a familiar profit stream because it seems like it's the fiduciary responsible thing to do is one thing. But leading in a new direction for the longer term, sustaining profits and more of them, that's the real goal.
Right.
The quarterly, it's a big problem in capitalism that we are so beholden to the near term, the popularity contest they call it, right, in the public equities.
Yep.
It's the popularity of a stock and the frothiness that can come from perception of limited supply and demand. No, sorry. It is not a weighing machine. It is a voting machine, the public equities. The weighing of something, the value of the thing, is what's told over time. And the sustainability of that really ultimately is a reflection of what's going on in the entire supply chain, all the way including the consumer and then the end of life for that product. Yep. How does that story get told?
Right.
And what are the longer term future revenue streams and ultimately the margin contribution that companies need to be looking for now? Right. That's the real question.
Right. That's a fabulous point. And like all things, and I knew this was going to happen. It always happens every podcast. I look at the clock and I realize, oh my God, 60 minutes just went by. So I have a sneaking suspicion we probably could go for the next 6 hours without even breaking a sweat. So, but I do want to be conscious of time because for all of us, but also for even the listeners who listen into this stuff, because there's so much information in here. So, any last minute thoughts, Scott, on just kind of what's coming up, or even for zero waste, or just closing out the year?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like kind of a selfish plug, but I would go into companiesforzerowaste.com, check out our website, what we're doing. I think a big part of the movement moving forward is for people to get out of their comfort zone. And just, I would say, in my humble opinion, if people are coming in and they want to learn, they can just come to our meetings and hear what is going on, and really just open up with this, kind of clear head and lens over, what we know today may be gone tomorrow. Things are going to move really quick in 2021, and I'm feeling a huge pent-up demand for this. And what does that mean? It means that companies are going to start working much more efficiently, and we can learn so much from our peers instead of working in silos. And I'll kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. Daniel, same question.
Well, I think the thing to look for and expect and hope for from all sides is complete transparency in the supply chain. Measure everything and be as transparent as possible that's actually earned trust. the transparency of reporting on progress made as well as distance yet to go.
Right.
To what was it? Tom of Tom's of Maine, something about, it's not about perfection. There is no such thing as a rival in this work. It's continuous improvement. It's not about perfection. It's about progress.
Right.
And also the rate of progress. Okay, sincere efforts to do the right thing. Accelerate that. Get on with it.
Yep.
Really focus. Hunker down. Double down. Invest heavily in getting to the right result. And then you get to talk about it. That's it.
Yeah.
We want to know. Everybody wants to know.
Well, and Scott's got the forum with which to sort of, champion those results. So this is again, great way to wind up the year. It's a little bit different from it's not different. It's inexorably tied supply chain and circularity, because it's a key component of the evolution of supply chain. Technology is going to drive this transparency, right? And it's going to allow us to start measuring and seeing and, gauging each other and how we're kind of performing. So it's a key conversation that's going to continue, but I think not only are you going to see innovation, Daniel, from your point of view, in just a lot of companies going into the sector, just even in simple things like recycling, but then Scott, obviously through zero waste, I think your participation rates are going to go up, which you're probably already seeing. And actually 2021, we're going to start seeing real action, right? Publishable case studies and things like that. It's super exciting. It's just a great time to be in this space. So I want to thank both of you guys for being on here. Like I said, we'll do a continuation of it, and we'll obviously participate, Scott, in the December 17th Zero Waste Roundtable and many of those there. And, Daniel, it was just a pleasure to meet you this morning. So it was really fun, guys.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
This is Richard Donaldson. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about the episode or topics in supply chain you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, why not check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud, collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at www.requis.com.